So what I'm going to be sharing with you now is the ignorant truth. And this is my ignorant truth. This is my lack of knowledge and me not having a general awareness of the past and how the past continues to shape the reality of Black people in America today. Now, I'm going to share this truth with you. And this is where I want the learning to begin, because I did not know a majority of these things. I did not know a majority of these things, and they did not teach this in school at all. But the information is out there and it's available for you to find out on your own. So in this next section, what we're going to be looking at are a couple different things. We're going to be looking at disadvantage. We're going to be looking at how having privileged, how both these things played a huge role in the social and cultural conditioning that impacts our lives today. So I hope you all are still with me and you're doing all right. We're going to keep pushing along. So let's just get on the same page around disadvantage and privilege, just so we can make sure the definitions are good to go. Disadvantage, an unfavorable circumstance or condition that reduces the chances of success or effectiveness. Privilege, a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group. Okay, just want to make sure we're on the same page about the definitions as we're going through. Slavery in America started in 1619. This lasted for 246 years. Now, when I talk about the type of slavery that we're looking at here, this was slavery that allowed an individual to own, buy and sell other individuals. And by other individuals, I mean Blacks in this particular case. There were other forms of slavery, but in this context, you know, we're talking about Blacks as a form of property. You were someone else's property. And there's four things that I want to kind of dive into with slavery. There's four things that we're going to look at. The first one is the slave auction. Now, this was a very lucrative business and essentially was an open market for slaves, for Blacks. They were inspected like animals, treated like animals, and, you know, they were sold to the highest bidder. In the 17th century, you know, a slave could go for 5 to 10 bucks. Going into the 19th century, a good slave, you know, could fetch an average price of $1,200 to $1,500. And so people were sold. I mean, it was a business that they had. And these slave owners were just kind of reaping it. They had these things called slave laws. And with the slave law, slaves could not read or write, couldn't go to school. Their movements were monitored. I mean, it was a big mess. The masters could take sexual liberties with the women. They actually rewarded good behavior. So there was a lot of conditioning that was going on for rebellious slaves. They were punished. When I talked about punished, we're talking about tarred and feathered. We're talking about whipped. We're talking about, you know, lynched, castrated. I mean, it goes on and on and on about the horrendous things that had actually occurred. The other thing is they established a very strict hierarchy. When you talk about a group of people that want to band together, what they did to help prevent revolts against the slave owners is that they started classifying, you know, these slaves. So you have the lighter slaves that might be in the house. The darker slaves might work in the field. You have some of the smarter ones that might have other sorts of responsibilities. But they created, you know, angst and inter-racism and hate within this group to keep them disjointed. People are stronger when they work together. And they knew that, and they kept these people separated. Marriages wasn't something that was legalized at all between black men and women. And but they encourage you to have families, because when you had the families, they could take your children and then go ahead and sell them, right? As part of the slave auction. The next thing that I want to to sort of share with you is an economy built on slavery. Now, a lot of the plantation owners, they were investing in cash crops. So the rice, tobaccos, cottons, sugar cane. Now, in the 1860s, the southern plantation supplied 75% of the world's cotton, 75%. And the more cotton that was being grown, the more slaves that you needed to harvest that cotton. And on the eve of the American Civil War, cotton accounted for 60% of Americans' exports. And this was all based on the free labor. And at this time, there were 4 million slaves, which equated to $3 billion. So $3 billion of free labor had netted the southern states about $200 million a year that they were getting. And this helped propel the U.S. into a position to one of the leading economies in the world. 4 million slaves, $3 billion, 200 million a year, hoping to bring America in the leading economy during this time. So you could see that it was an economic necessity. And this economic necessity actually trumped morality. And what I mean by that is the slave labor was so entrenched in the Southern economy, because it was making money, that when it came a chance for them to sort of look at, should all men be treated equal? They said, nah, it's okay. So they actually started going through, the North and the South got together in one of their meetings, and they were talking about, there were about 700,000 slaves in the late 1700s, and that was about $210 million in today's dollars, roughly around that. And the North and the South, they were talking, they were saying, hey, we would like to, the South was saying, we'd like to take the slaves that we have and we want to treat them one-to-one to whites, right? So they can have a larger representation. And the North said, nope, we're not going to do that, because if we do that, that's going to put us at a disadvantage. So we're going to make a compromise. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that every Black person isn't a whole person. It's 3/5 of the person. The 3/5 of the person, and we're going to stop the slave trade so that you don't keep bringing slaves over. So that was the deal. They didn't say, well, we're not treating people correctly, so let's just stop doing this altogether. What they said was, we're making $200 million a year. We want to keep that going. We want to make sure the South doesn't have, more of a representation. So we're going to devalue the individual of the slave. And we'll stop the slave trade, not because we feel it's wrong, just because we don't want you Southerners to continue to have more people. It's the people that have the power that can make these rules and regulations to get things done. And you think about that decision. Did morality not matter? And it talks about greed, how greed took precedence over everything. Here's the other interesting thing. In the history books, they decouple this idea that slavery was even there. Like, hey, the depicted history of America, capitalism without slavery. Hey, we worked hard, we got things going. And it was this, this required thing. Slavery was a part of it. It wasn't as it's described, but it was there. They tried to downplay this concept of slavery. And again, I did not learn any of this in school at all. Interesting fact. This was back in, let me get my notes here. Back in April 18th, it's a little while ago, I have the references here, but there was an 8th grade charter school that had received an assignment. This assignment was called The Life of Slaves, A Balanced View, which asked the students to sort of do a negative and positive, like pro-con sort of analysis on the aspects of slavery. And one of the lines in the text that said that not all slaves are unhappy. Now, granted, there were some slaves, like house slaves, that weren't treated like the slaves that were in the field. But if you were held against your will, not being able to do what you needed to do, to have a family, to live your life, to enjoy the sun, to just be happy in life, would you be happy? The textbooks have this text in it. They don't paint the horrible picture that exists. And you have to ask yourself, why? Why isn't this information that's exposed at all? Okay. So we're going to move on. So we have slavery. Slavery ended in 1865. And as part of slavery ending, and this happened with the Civil War, we introduced the Reconstruction Era. And with the Reconstruction Era, the primary goal was to kind of take these southern states that were off on their own and kind of integrate them back in. So there are three things that I want to talk about during this Reconstruction time. The first is the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment ended the slave economy. And it was a provision, it set up some provisions essentially that said slaves are free. It abolished slavery, but it said it abolished slavery except as a punishment of a crime. And I'm going to come back to this in a second. The next thing that the Reconstruction Era had was the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau was set up to help pretty much support the 4 million slaves that are now been integrated into society. So it helped them with getting food, medical support. There were things that they had with negotiating in the workplace. So good wages, they get a chance to choose their boss or choose who they'd like to work for. So it was really sort of helping them. They were able to go to school. So I'm going to set that up. Now, the main reason for the Freedmen's Bureau, other than helping the blacks, or the freedmen's, were that the land, they were going to distribute land. So there was something that was called 40 acres and a mule. And the US government was going to promise all the freemen 40 acres and a mule. But this was something that was never fulfilled. Now, during this time period, you had the black codes that came up. And the reason why this is important is because that exception that I mentioned as part of the 13th Amendment, saying that except as punishment for a crime, what the black code did is that the plantation owners felt like, shoot, if the free men actually get this land, what's going to happen to, like our plantations? They're going to collapse, right? Because at this point in time, it was $3 billion of labor that they were trying to recoup now that all these slaves are free. And so they ended up establishing a set of black laws that were targeted just for black people. And pretty much it was to allow the Southerners to gain controls over the free slaves. So I just want to spend a few moments just talking about a few of these black codes. This was just a note from a newspaper in the South when it was talking about the South held this opinion that there's such a racial difference in the mental and moral nature of whites and blacks that it's impossible to be able to have a mixed community in the same law. Like this was just the mindset and how things were. So black codes, and I'm just going to stick on just a few of these. Labor contracts. Labor contracts essentially was a contract between servants, the blacks, and their masters. And this is what the rules were for the contract. Black servants had to reside on the employer's property, remain quiet and orderly, work from sunup to sunset except on Sundays, and not leave the premises or receive visitors without the master's permission. Masters could moderately whip servants under 18 to discipline them, and whipping older servants would require a judge's order. Any time lost due to sickness, they would deduct the pay. If someone quit, they forfeit all their wages, could be arrested, and then have to work for free. So you could see that it was another form of slavery that they had. Vagrancy laws, it was the same thing. This was a way of forcing people to sign. So if you didn't have a job, if you were a peddler or a gambler, you would fall under a labor contract. The same thing with apprenticeships. They took orphans and children of vagrants, and they would be printers or be part of a apprenticeship, working under a labor contract for these plantation owners. And so these black codes was just another way of suppressing the black community at this time. So with black codes, it entered in now the Jim Crow era, and this lasted about 100 years. And this was all around segregation. And Jim Crow was actually based off of a fictional character from a black minstrel show. And for those that aren't familiar with that, if you've heard of the term blackface, whites would paint their faces black and then sort of over exaggerate, black, characters. And so Jim Crow happened to be one of these fictional characters that they had come up with this law for. And essentially what these laws did, it was really to marginalize African Americans and deny them the right to vote, hold jobs, be educated, have any sort of opportunities. And it was all around sort of segregation. And so you're familiar with this. And any attempt to sort of go against these laws, were fines, sentenced to jail, could face arrest, even death. People were hung. And another interesting little note here is that the law enforcement in the South originally began as a vigilante group to recapture escaped slaves. And when the Jim Crow laws were established after slavery was abolished, they were just primarily set up just to enforce these laws, to sort of get things going. So that's where that started. Now, the Jim Crow laws ended. I told you this had gone on for about 100 years, but just 72 years ago, the military was integrated. 66 years ago, schools were integrated. 56 years ago, we had the Civil Rights. 55 years ago, right to vote. 52 years ago, Fair Housing Act. So this is less than a year that we just recently had some of these things, come to light and what's going on. And there were a lot of, Harry Trudman, the Supreme Court, Lyndon B. Johnson, they helped with passing some of these laws, but there were a lot of great, revolutionary leaders like Nat Turner, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King that helped pave the way to lay the foundation to contribute towards ending, the Jim Crow laws. So there's this history that sort of is going on. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is I was researching on how can I tell this story in a very concise way. I ended up finding something that condensed 349 years of an oppressed people in a very concise way. And I want to share this, with you and have you just read it to see if it resonates with you on what's being said, if you think it's an accurate depiction of black and white relations in America. So this is Barry, who actually created this comic strip. Here's his comic. So, I'd like you just to think about, given what you've heard me say, would you see that this is accurate, from your point of view, and just to think about that and sort of what's going on. Yeah, and if you have your thoughts, I would love for you to sort of share them online. My goal is to have some discussion after this as well. So if there are things that you have to share, I would encourage you to kind of share them through the chat.